Good day, friends, and thank you for joining me. Jeffrey Sachs, the world-renowned economist and advisor to governments around the world since the Soviet era, has come up with a three-point peace plan that, if implemented, could stop the war almost immediately. Let's look at that plan and also ask ourselves the question, why are world leaders not chomping at the bit to get the details and implement this amazing idea?
The low level of discussion in Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, in London, in Paris is shocking.
Europe's answer to the war has become a mantra. More weapons, more funding, more sanctions, talk of European troops in a so-called peacekeeping role, endless meetings self-praising their own entity. It has echoes of the Kamala Harris campaign, all smiles and hype. Does any of this ease the conflict? What the European leaders call peace is beginning to look like something else entirely. In contrast was Glenn Diesen's low-key interview with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He laid out a sharp three-step peace strategy that starts with Ukraine's neutrality backed by UN guarantees and neutral mediators. From 2022 onwards, Europe's resistance to peace has simply prolonged the bloodletting, and still today, this festering wound across Europe shows no signs of healing. So is it time to rip off the bandage and say it out loud? Europe's narrative and posturing has failed. The Kursk offensive alone, with massive European investment, training and hype, cost tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. And for what? What happened to Napoleon and Hitler's ventures into Russia? With Europe's narrative collapsed, that exclusive club of dictators now greets its newest member.
In my view, history and logic shows that Ukraine's real security is neutrality.
Neutrality is desirable for both sides of a conflict. That single sentence cuts through all the narrative of Brussels and Washington. Neutrality isn't capitulation. It's the only way Ukraine can survive. And it's not just Sachs saying this. Back in 1997, George Kennan, the very architect of America's Cold War containment policy, warned that NATO expansion would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-war era, and would eventually provoke conflict with Russia. And how right was he? Years later, in 2008, US Ambassador William Burns, now the CIA director, wrote the famous cable, Nyet Means Nyet. He reported to Washington that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. He warned that ignoring this would lead directly to confrontation. Sachs echoes these wise voices. Neutrality isn't weakness, and as Sachs explained, Austria shows what neutrality looks like.
Austria is my favorite case because it was an explicit design that Austria would become neutral in 1955. The Soviet troops would leave, and I think it's right to say the Soviet Union never bothered Austria again, nor did Russia bother Austria.
And Ukraine's path today? Billions in Western weapons and not one strategic gain. Sachs is blunt. NATO membership for Ukraine is a dead end. It means permanent war. And Europe's latest idea, a coalition of the willing, looks to Moscow like NATO by another name. For Russia, it changes nothing. So here's the truth. Europe's obsession with dragging Ukraine toward NATO and under its wing of protection has not brought security, it has brought devastation. Neutrality seems to be the only path that doesn't end in permanent war. So step one is simple. Ukraine declares itself neutral, an independent state guaranteed by international law. Step two of Sachs' plan is a negotiated settlement. Neutrality by itself isn't enough. The borders, the language rights, the future of the Donbass and Crimea must be settled at the table, not on the battlefield. Sachs has been a consistent advocate for diplomacy as the only viable path to ending the war in Ukraine. He emphasises that neutrality alone won't suffice. The core issues such as territorial boundaries, language rights, and the status of regions like Donbass and Crimea must be addressed. Sachs points out that Russia has shown a willingness to negotiate, citing the near agreement in Istanbul in March 2022, where a draft peace agreement was on the table. This agreement proposed Ukrainian neutrality and security guarantees, but it was ultimately rejected under pressure from NATO and European allies. Now the war has dragged on, destroying Ukraine's economy and depopulating its land. The refusal to engage in negotiations, Sachs argues, has prolonged the conflict, leading to devastating consequences for Ukraine. The war has severely impacted the country's economy, displaced millions, and resulted in significant life loss. A negotiated settlement, according to Sachs, doesn't mean one side achieves all its objectives. Instead, it involves compromise, drawing lines that both parties can accept, even if neither gets everything they want. This approach is essential for lasting peace. Sachs highlights that the art of diplomacy is not about victory, but about finding common ground and making difficult concessions for the greater good. Sachs critiques the role of external actors, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, in influencing Ukraine's stance on negotiations. He argues that their pressure has contributed to an extended war. Remember the European outcry when Viktor Orban had the gall to travel to Moscow to speak with President Putin. And former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, according to the Quincy Institute, during their bilateral meeting on April the 10th, 2022, Johnson reportedly advised Zelensky not to entertain a compromise peace, nor to offer Russia Ukraine neutrality to end the war, for two key reasons. Putin cannot be negotiated with, and the West isn't ready for the war to end. The price of that advice is visible today in blood and rubble. Ultimately, Sachs contends that diplomacy is not just an option, it is the only viable path forward. Without a willingness to negotiate, the war risks becoming an endless cycle of violence with no clear end in sight. Sachs warns that Ukraine risks becoming another Afghanistan, another Syria, a war with no end. Step 3 involves neutral mediators and UN security guarantees.
The logical place for a real security arrangement is the UN Security Council. That automatically brings in the US, UK, and France, but also Russia and China.
Neutrality declared is only words on paper unless it's enforced. Sachs points to neutral mediation and UN guarantees as the mechanism that can make peace real. Such arrangements are not theory. They worked for Austria. They worked for Finland after the Second World War. Both secured independence and peace through neutrality enforced by guarantees respected on both sides. Sachs stresses security arrangements are solvable. This is not a breaking point of negotiation. Even China has offered to act as guarantor, according to Ruslan Belov. The offer was dismissed, with Kiev insisting only the states that armed it during the war could be trusted. In practice, this excludes neutral guarantors and ensures the cycle of escalation continues. Europe's proposal to act as peacekeepers highlights the problem. Europe is not neutral. Its interest is not impartial mediation, but weakening Russia. Putting Europe in charge guarantees continued confrontation. Neutral oversight under the UN would be slower, messier, less dramatic, but it would carry legitimacy. It would provide the accountability that Europe cannot. Without the third step, neutrality and negotiation remain fragile. With it, peace gains structure and a chance of survival. Sachs' plan rests on three elements: neutrality, negotiation, and enforcement. None are revolutionary, all have precedent. Yet each has been ignored in favour of escalation, especially by Europe more recently. To be fair, Trump has attempted to negotiate and push things forward at this rather late stage. But the outcome is plain: prolongation of the war, devastation of Ukraine, and a Europe drifting towards deeper conflict. The takeaway from this is probably that peace is not absent because it's impossible, it's absent because it is resisted.